תתארו לכם באמצע יום יפה, שמיים עליכם, הערבה איתכם, כן ככה זה קרה, לפתע היא אמרה, אני עוד זוכר אותה, כמו בסערה, תתארו לכם אותי נופל, לתוך זרועותיה. תתארו לכם עולם פשוט, חדר ללילה, בית בגשם, ריחות עצים מלאים בתות, ושנינו שיכורים, אם ניפרד אני אמות, היא לוחשת וגועשת, תתארו לכם עוד הזדמנות, לחזור פתאום לנעורים. תתארו לכם את החיים זזים אחורה וקדימה, מה שחסר שהוא מתמלא, מה שהיה פתאום ישנו, ואני מביט לתוך עיניה ונגנב בכוח פנימה. תתארו לכם אותנו מגשימים את כל החלומות. תתארו לכם באמצע יום יפה, שמיים עליכם, הערבה איתכם, כן ככה זה קרה, לפתע היא אמרה, אני עוד זוכר אותה, כמו בסערה, תתארו לכם אותי נופל לתוך זרועותיה. תתארו לכם עולם יפה, פחות עצוב ממשהו ככה, ואנחנו שם הולכים עם שמש בכיסים. תתארו לכם עולם יפה, עיר בתוך החושך, עולם פשוט, תתארו לכם קצת אושר.
היא בליבי עכשיו, בתוך ליבי, כמו הרבה צללים, כמו הרבה שבילים, כמו עשן. היא רק שלי עכשיו, היא בחובי, כנוף הרבה עלים, כמנהר כחולי, עכשיו היא כאן. אהבתיה, אני יודע זאת פתאום, אהבתיה, פתאום עכשיו, פתאום היום, כן היא שלי עכשיו, כמו השיר, עולה היא מתוכי, עולה בכל כוחי, כמו השיר. אני קורא בכל בני האדם ומרחבי שם וכל רוחות הים והגלים. אם תשמעי אותי ואת שירי המתפרץ קיים צועק אל העולם, רק תשמעי. אהבתיה, אני יודע זאת פתאום, אהבתיה, פתאום עכשיו, פתאום היום, כן היא שלי עכשיו, כמו השיר, עולה היא מתוכי, עולה בכל כוחי, כמו השיר. את בליבי עכשיו, בתוך ליבי, כמו הרבה צללים, כמו הרבה שבילים, כמו עשן. את רק שלי עכשיו, את בחובי, כנוף הרבה עלים, כמנהר חולי, עכשיו את כאן. 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 שם בתוך מיטה, מול קיר ענק כחול, קר וזול, לפעמים אתה נאנח בלי קול, ובכל זאת, אמא שם שומרת גם כשאתה גדול, מחליפה לך בגדים, אומרת שאתה מלך הגברים, בשבילה אתה יכול להיות מה שבא לך לראש, למשל מלך החיות או מלך ההרים. אם תטפס אישה, קום תהיה כל מה שבא לך, כי בשבילה אתה תמיד מלך העולם. שם אתה תמיד, כל מה שתרצה, רק תבחר, כך אומרת היא, ואתה שואל, מה עוד אפשר? מה שלא הייתי בטח לא אהיה, מחליפה לך בגדים, אומרת שאתה מלך הגברים, בשבילה אתה יכול להיות מה שבא לך לראש, למשל מלך החיות או מלך ההרים. אם תטפס אישה, קום תהיה כל מה שבא לך, כי בשבילה אתה תמיד מלך העולם. בשבילה אתה מלך השירים, בשבילה אתה יכול להיות מה שבא לך לראש.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mishelanu and the Paris Center for Peace and Innovation's joint Dare to Discuss session. My name is Lee Levinson, and I'm a Mishelanu Fellow at UC Berkeley. Within this session, we will focus on two debates, starting with one about academia amidst the coronavirus for the first 45 minutes, and continuing for the following 45 minutes with a debate about international relations. We encourage you to stay and engage in both debates. And I encourage everyone to turn your cameras on and to make sure you're in Zoom speaker view for the best experience. Please post questions for the speakers at any time in the chat, or if you're joining us on live, in the comments below. And we will address as many as we can towards the end of the debates. It's with great pleasure that I would like to introduce our speakers for the first debate over academia and the push and pull between traditional classroom learning and online learning amidst the coronavirus. Onamir is currently a professor of marketing and the associate dean at UCSD's Rady School of Management, the chief behavioral science officer at Fiverr Inc., and was previously an assistant professor of marketing at Yale University. His research explores marketing strategy, consumer behaviors, pricing, risk and uncertainty, judgment and decision-making, behavioral economics, and business analytics. He's at the forefront of introducing online learning in business schools and will be speaking today to the power of online learning. Our second speaker is Orly Lobel. She is the Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at University of San Diego, serves as the Director of Employment and Labor Law Program, and is a founding member of the Center for Intellectual Property Law and Markets at the university. She has taught at Yale, Tel Aviv University, and other leading institutions around the world. Lobel is one of the most cited public law scholars in the nation, has award-winning books and articles, and frequently speaks at top research institutions, industry, and government forums worldwide. Today, she will be emphasizing the value of in-person learning. We're going to begin with our first question. If you could tell us very briefly how you would describe the last semester and the way academia adapted to these changes.
Are we starting with me?
Sure.
Sure. Okay. So, well, first of all, this is great that we're doing this panel because I think everybody is at this moment of uncertainty. And we as university professors feel this, and as parents, we have a student or a daughter who is college bound, and everybody has been experiencing an upheaval. So I think the first point in this kind of session would be to say that what we've been experiencing in that rapid shift during a crisis, during a pandemic, from offline, from the normal routine of learning in person to online learning is really not representative of the potential and the kind of aspirational hybrid learning that I think that we've already started working toward for a long time. There's been a lot of innovation in online learning and bringing all sorts of technologies into the classroom. But I think that we should really not judge what's happening right now and the quality of teaching that has been happening when semester just shift from one day to another to a quarantine reality of what we will be moving toward.
Thank you so much. On, would you like to share?
Yeah, I think that just to put things more formally, when the pandemic hit, most universities just took what they were doing offline and tried to do it through Zoom. In order to do better, there are a lot of standard practice, best practices of how to do this in a way that engages the students much better. Most professors had no clue how to do this. The University of California announced a long time ago that the summer is also going to be remote. So in preparation of that, we've had a lot of workshops with our faculty to teach them how to do this much better. In addition to this, there's also a class of courses that are asynchronous remote, which means that they do not need Zoom in order to convey material. Just to give perspective, in order to prepare a 30-hour course that is completely asynchronous remote, the faculty has to invest 150 hours to prepare at the minimum, preparing a lot of materials. And then you could still do office hours through Zoom, but the content will be an engaging online course that was designed for that and not what we're seeing right now. I don't know if Orly touched on this or not, but there's also a difference between courses that better fit remote instructions and courses that less fit remote instruction. We might talk about this in a bit.
Great. So why don't I pose our main question, our big question: how will the pandemic alter the future of teaching and learning? And what will higher education lose or gain as a result of these changes?
Yeah, so we already started alluding to this, that we've been thinking in academia, in higher education, about moving to what we call a hybrid model for a while now. And there are a lot of advantages when we use our digital technologies, our online capabilities in educating our younger generation. Right now we're not only at a moment of a pandemic, but we, of course, here in the United States are in a great moment of upheaval about inequities, socioeconomic and racial exclusions. And I think that, these are political questions, but they are basically normative and social questions about how education is the great democratizer. And now that we have all these technologies, we should really be very excited about embracing them and doing them well, as undescribed, doing them with a planned, focused way, having best practices. So what do I mean by hybrid models? First of all, there are different kinds of capabilities and instructions that we as professors give our students, and things that we want them to come out with as individuals and as communities when they graduate. I'm a law professor and On is a business school professor, and we also think a lot about undergrad learning. And as we receive our graduate students, we see who's better prepared and who's less prepared for becoming professionals and sending them into the world and becoming attorneys, for example. What we have to remember is that there's certain things that we can give in terms of kind of straight out materials and knowledge, information that we can give online, even in asynchronous way, just preparing a lot of kind of raw data. For example, I teach a lot of cases. So they don't change that much. I can prepare these as videos, and I think that that's part of the future, that our students, I'm teaching a class next week, actually, I'm starting a condensed class via Zoom at Tel Aviv University. I was supposed to teach it in person. I'm going to be teaching it via Zoom. Some of the things that I'm teaching with my PowerPoints, etc., I could have just recorded and put out there. What I think is the great advantage is that now we can think about all these other capabilities that sometimes have been neglected in higher education. And there's been a lot of worry about that. How many hands-on assessments are we giving? How much individualized, personalized attention are we giving to our students? How much feedback and kind of back and forth are we giving? And now we can start really being much more fine-tuned and saying, okay, these are the elements that we really want to keep in person. And if it's not in person, kind of in the same room, at least now we're talking, actually, the new thing that we talk about in higher education is face-to-face, F2F now. So things that are synchronous and are smaller, breakout rooms, all these technologies that we're now learning about. And as On said, we at University of San Diego, just like at the UC system, we're very focused on now training our professors, our faculty, our administration to get really the cutting edge technologies that will enable us to do that.
Okay, so faculty, I wouldn't say are lazy, because they're not, but they have this heuristic that if it's not broken, don't fix it. If I've taught a course for 20 years and students seem to be learning and I get good ratings, nobody complains to the dean, there's very little incentive to change it. Now of course, if you're teaching a course about social media, you have to change it every quarter because social media changes all the time. But if you're teaching basic courses that teach students how to think, that doesn't change much. You asked how this pandemic will change the face of education. This pandemic has caused everybody to have to stop and think. And if you look at how many new proposals the university committees now have to deal with of new course approvals and different ways to teach courses, they're skyrocketing because you force smart people to stop and think about how they're doing something, and now they're thinking. And so you will see a lot more flipped classrooms, which is study all like the material that Orly described, study all the material that you don't need me for on your own, but then let's come and have an informed discussion together about what it means. So you'll see a lot more models like that. entering classes that have not changed in millennia. And you will also see a difference between some institutions. So the big, robust research institution whose budgets are not driven by tuition alone will continue what they're doing and can absorb this big economic shock. But you'll see, I think, a lot of the schools that rely solely on teaching, especially teaching foreign students, get hurt really badly, and some of them might go out of business. You will see a lot more flexibility from academic institutions on grading practices. We've seen it already, where instead of trying to give a grade to some noisy signals I get from remote participants, I might give a pass-fail to a course as opposed to a particular grade. You'll see a lot more technologies for testing coming online. How do you test people and maintain academic integrity when they're not all in a room, right? And so there are a lot of methodologies, there's a lot of research on what drives honesty in test taking. You'll see a lot more of that coming to play. As Orly mentioned, the principles we're trying to teach are probably not going to change. The ways in which we're teaching and the topics that we are teaching will see an upgrade. I will say that it's already been happening for a while. This is just a catalyzer. So engineering schools have known for a while that they're teaching most of their students towards jobs that don't exist right now. That the materials that they teach in year one, half of it will be obsolete in year 3 because technology is moving so fast. In a business school, we're training people for the business world. Most of the jobs that people will take are jobs that we don't necessarily know what their name, because so many new things are being created. The pandemic is just causing us to accelerate all these processes.
Great. And so both of you did touch a little bit on these before, but why don't we spend a few minutes to elaborate on the advantages or disadvantages of traditional classroom learning versus online learning?
Yeah, so the thing about it is that we don't want to think about it in that kind of dichotomous way, because a classroom experience has infinite ways in which it might look like. In law schools, we talk about the Socratic method, and that's something that's very important to me as a professor and to my colleagues, where we think that the way that people learn is not just from listening to us lecture, but from actually solving problems and from us asking questions and the students answering the questions, and then we kind of push on them. We have what we call the cold calling, the cold call that everybody's so afraid of when they are first year law students. They sit and hide in their little space, and they hope that the professor won't call on them. And of course, I call on the person that's hiding the most. And so again, I want to emphasize that sometimes we have this idea that the online is kind of less hands-on versus the offline is that maybe that's more the kind of personal connection. It doesn't have to be that way, but I think that what we've been saying, both of us, is that we have to find the comparative advantages of each place and the variety of technologies that are available to us and the varieties of interaction, and then emphasize what we really care about. There's a lot of talk right now with the pandemic. I'm sure our listeners have heard of this 10-4 idea. That's also, it started from thinking about going back to the workplace, and companies have been saying 10 days at home, 4 days at work. So now we're thinking about this too. When we're thinking about next year, we just had these, faculty meetings where we say, okay, well, we'll have a lot of these online interactions. And then when we're in the classroom, we'll do it in smaller groups. We'll do the Socratic method even more effectively because I won't have to lecture at all. I'll be able to immediately jump into saying, whoever is just in front of me, you tell me, what is the holding in this case? What are the lessons? How would you argue the other side? So that kind of interaction is really important. The other thing that I really want to emphasize, and it's true both in at the college level, very, very true at the college level. And if our listeners are trying to think about differentiating between different programs, different kinds of colleges that they might choose. And it's also very true at business schools. And if you're going for an MBA or going for a law degree, is the interaction among students. That's a super valuable component of higher education, the network that you form, the alumni that is then part of your professional path, the types of interactions that happen in the corridors, in the teamwork, in the collaborations, in the different missions that tasks that we give our students. All of that, again, I think that once we maybe kind of take out the just pure lecturing, knowledge giving, kind of one directional way of educating and put that all in the highest quality, you still want to have it a very high quality, you want the best faculty to do it. You put that all and package it in the online world, and then you have so much time and so many resources for all this rest of the interactions.
So Orly goes so far from the question. I have to sort of retrace where we started. There's a question in the chat. I'll start with that just because it's interesting. So it says, what classes should students supplement their current studies to prepare for the job market? My simplest answer to that would be analytics. That's the market that's booming and doesn't get hurt by the pandemic. But to get back to the original question, there are obvious trade-offs. We teach our MBA through a logic of learning by doing. Doing is a lot harder when you have to do it remotely or online. Students don't want to give up. They're getting together, working in team. There's really no substitute to the person-to-person interaction. And it's not the interaction in the class they're looking for. It's interaction, what we call the water cooler effect. It's interaction around, let's go get coffee together. Let's get a snack. That's when they start and throw some ideas, and maybe a startup would emerge from that. That is really hard to replace because everything we do through digital media requires intentionality. We do it for a specific purpose. We're not allowing for the intuitive interaction when we do that. So we have to remember that there's a huge trade-off. And I'll give you an example. One trade-off. I'm teaching a class in the fall that is called Lab to Market. I'm going to have 90 students, grad students in the class, and I need them to work in teams. And for that, having the Zoom breakout room aspect is amazing. We can do that quite easily, but they'll not get so what do you think about what we just did walking out of the classroom, which is a hugely important effect. And we have to find ways to mitigate that. And I can tell you that I don't think we've found them yet. On the other hand, I'll give you kind of the counter to Orly's cold calling. I taught a course from San Diego through Zoom to Tokyo, about 75 people in their homes. The Japanese culture is not one for a Socratic method. They don't jump and participate. Their learning culture is sitting in the room and writing what the professor says, and if they don't agree with the professor, they try very hard to think of why they are wrong, as opposed to some other traditions, like in the Jewish religion, we are encouraged to consider all the reasons why the professor is wrong. And so having taught by Zoom allowed a chat. And when I threw a question, they wrote down. And I had much more participation from a Japanese audience through Zoom than I ever had in real life. And the Japanese are extreme, but think about all the introverts out there that don't like throwing their opinion in a big room and having it ridiculed by others and the professor. And so there are advantages and disadvantages. The Zoom interaction with the chat allows for some advantages. Academia is just coming to grasp with the beginning of this. The business world has been using Zoom and other methods for a while. They know how to do this, but they're not doing education and they're not educating 18-year-olds. So there's going to be a period now where there's a transition period where universities go through a period of learning how to do this better. They're going to come up with some crazy ideas that don't work, but they're going to come up with some good ideas. And over time, we're going to see a much more elaborate portfolio of how content is being driven.
Thank you so much. So now I want to touch on something that Owen mentioned earlier. There will be a financial blowback for a lot of institutes of higher learning. So how do you think that the financial blowback of the pandemic will affect the future of learning in institutions?
And do you want to start with that one?
Sure. So as I alluded to that, the financial structure of higher education institutions is quite different. As you know, there are public universities, there are private universities, there are even for-profit universities, even though most of the real universities are not for-profit. Most of the what I would call research real universities, their budget is not completely dependent on tuition. And so there's varying degrees of hits to university budgets given the COVID-19 and the subsequent recession. I will say that in business schools, for example, enrollment is counter-cyclical with the economy. So when the economy slows down and there's more unemployment, more people think it's a pretty good time to go to a business school. Let's spend 2 years, upgrade our CV, and then rejoin the business world when things are better. And so it really depends on where you are. The undergraduate situation in University of California, for example, is going to be mostly unaffected because most of the students are from California, and the University of California budget is going to take a hit, but the hit that we will deal with by cost cutting and doing things that are required. All this pandemic and the geopolitical situation will cause fewer international students from being able to come even if they want to. And so we might see a slightly different mix on campus, even though we are going to admit students who didn't get a visa yet and start teaching them remotely and allow them to a longer process to get their visa. So in short, there will be institutions that get hit badly, even shut down, but the major universities will be fine and the students will probably not feel the big difference. The administration and the faculty have to deal with cost cutting and things like that, but it's not at the student side.
Let me jump in and give a plug to public education. So we are here in the Israeli American Council, and there's been very important differences between the development of Israeli education, higher education, and American higher education. At this point, we have, it's also a hybrid model, we have private and public schools in both continents, but we see, I think, again, with the global pandemic and with the upheavals and unrest that are the result of inequities and exclusion, we see the importance of investment that in education, in skills, in training, and in knowledge more broadly than just kind of professional training that An and I are in professional schools at the university, but also just basic knowledge that go beyond just kind of the immediate market. So unsaid, business schools are counter-cyclical. I think universities in general are counter-cyclical at times to the job market. And it's a good time for people to think about education and a degree. But there's also a problem that even within universities, probably some of you know, we have a lot of tensions and debates and fights on where to invest the resources. So even a wealthy university sometimes puts more money to kind of cater to the current tastes or the predictions or the kind of a consumer attitude, which is good in some ways, but we also have to remember that we need to invest in the humanities, for example, that seem to be less marketable in the job market. And I have to give our listeners some perspective that learning a degree in humanities and not engineering, if that's your passion, it's actually a very valuable thing. It doesn't maybe translate into the immediate job at Google, even though even a place like Google says that it wants a great variety of disciplines when it hires. But we need so many of our the whole spectrum of the kinds of learning and kinds of disciplines and fields that we have in academia. We see right now the consequences when we don't invest in kind of public infrastructure and long-term science and kind of healthcare and scientific discovery. It's something that's really essential. So the bottom line is that the future of academia is going to be, in some ways, quite similar to the past of academia, where we need it. People should have access to learning, and we need to think about who's in and out, who benefits, and kind of always be with an eye to the market, and try to have a very predictive, what's the professional next stage that people need, but also have this broad spectrum of what kind of people are we creating in our society, what kind of communities are we creating.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to shift to a Q&A. We're going to be pooling questions from our conversation here on Zoom and also from the platforms on the app and from Facebook Live. So if you're watching with us, please pose your questions. So why don't we start with the questions that are in the chat. It says, management education has been around for not more than 100 years, and in most of the subjects being taught in management and business for much less time than that.
That wasn't a question. I said we've been teaching for a millennia, and I meant we, broadly speaking, in universities. Somebody took me literally to say that I meant business schools have been teaching things for a millennia. So yes.
Great. Then we'll move on. Do you think deferment for the fall is going to become a problem for the class graduating high school in 2021?
So I'm not sure problem for who. Many universities have been very flexible with students that are asking to defer. And when I said that university budgets are getting a hit, that's part of it. And I think that universities have shown great flexibility in this turbulent time to let students do what's best for them. Personally, I think quote unquote hiding from the situation in an academic educational environment is the best thing someone can do. And I think that the difference in value you're getting based on whether some of the classes are remote or hybrid is negligible. Most of the universities are putting effort into making sure that the new students actually get more face-to-face time. So prioritizing them in all the decisions that are being made about strategies of how to incorporate some students in person and others not. So I don't think that, my own personal view is that I would not defer. I don't think that unless you're going to do something humanitarian to help in the crisis, I think the best thing you can do is invest in your own intellectual capital.
Yeah, so I don't know if our audience knows this, but the daughter that I mentioned that is heading to college next year is not only my daughter, but she's also Un's daughter. So we don't have the same last name, but we are happily married and have several articles together and several kids together. we do research in behavioral and economics occasionally. So we face these questions about should students who are seniors in high school right now defer or go to college? We face them as educators and as parents. And I've been seeing our daughter she committed to Stanford. She had great choices, and she decided actually between her top two choices, Yale and Stanford, the pandemic was really pushing her to be closer to home because, who knows when you have to kind of fold and leave and things like that. So she committed, and then, a lot of her classmates are raising that question. Should they be headed to college? These are not normal times. So, what's the alternative? It's the job market is not very good. You can't really travel and explore and be outside. So I very much agree with On that we're just going to get better. We collectively as universities at doing the online and kind of in-person online hybrids better. And I would very much encourage everybody to kind of continue their plans and not derail them because of what's going on right now. And it will, hopefully pass, and people will come out with a degree sooner and with a sense of community, and they'll have a network and, an institution that backs them up when they're looking for jobs.
I just, if you want to add to that, the biggest need that arises in dire times and in a time of pandemic is the need for community. And the social distancing goes against that. Going to school at a university, being on campus is, I think, a very positive thing, not only for utilitarian reasons, but as already mentioned at the end, for well-being reasons, because you're going to be in a community connected, and universities do a lot to ensure that that's the case.
We have another question. Do you think that there is a chance that universities will make cuts to the mid-level administrative structure that has grown in the last 20 to 30 years, or will they make cuts in other ways, maybe like changing the faculty and programs that might not be as beneficial?
So
yeah. Oh, go ahead, On.
So it's not about chances, it's about what universities are doing. And I can tell you that in the University of California, they are engaged in budget cuts that are not, as right now, they're not going to hurt the main mission. And at the UC San Diego, nobody's getting fired and nobody's getting furloughed. But the way they cut about $600 million from the budget is by holding back on potentially on investments that are not must-have for the next year, on hiring new staff and growing administration unless it's really, really justified. Basically being more efficient. And most universities that are managed well can do that.
Yeah, I think a lot of universities have announced hiring freeze also at the faculty level. And that's, that's a challenge for those students and graduate students, if they're, people who are listening online right now and are interested in academia. That's kind of a scary prospect. There's been, again, it's not a new trend. I write about the labor market in general in my research, and just like in other industries, like engineering and journalism and entertainment and manufacturing, where all of these industries have been moving to what we call the gig economy, where it's kind of more looser ties with the job and not kind of a full-time job security versus they're more freelancers. There's been a lot of recent exposés about how universities, again, even before the pandemic, in the past decade or so, have been moving dramatically to a lot of adjunct rather than full-time faculty because they're much cheaper. They don't do research; they just teach, the students. But they are usually also less experienced. They're less committed, and some of them are great resources and great faculty, but they get a lot less, so they're cheap. Again, this is kind of a reminder that at the end of the day, the differences between the brands, the well-resourced universities, the universities that are higher ranked, I think they'll have that competitive advantage of continuing to hire excellent research faculty that are also excellent teachers, versus the places that will really be struggling. We'll do a lot of these budget cuts and less hiring, less staffing, and it will be in some ways a downward spiral. Now, I mean, some of that is fine. Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, said, it's good to have constructive destruction. We don't have to have every single institution survive or every model survive. We want to come out, with the best of the best, but we have to think about, the institutional goals of educating the future generation.
Thank you.
I'll just add to that a little bit. So the goal of universities and the research universities is to generate knowledge. It's not surprising that most of the explosion of high tech happens near and around top research universities. And by high tech, I mean biotech, life science, whatever, all the knowledge, innovation economy. The faculty role in those universities is first and foremost to do research, and that's what faculty are being promoted for. And so you can think about whether the pandemic hurts some of the funding for research. That's a topic for a different conversation. I think that we will not see a big change in the research universities. In teaching universities, if they have fewer students, they have to hire fewer faculty, and so they will use fewer adjuncts or lecturers or whatever as needed.
Thank you. All right, and looks like we have time for another question. So one of our viewers said that Oli mentioned equality issues, and some students don't have the space or the bandwidth needed to learn from home. How are colleges trying to remedy that?
Let me pick up that.
Yeah.
So I think UC San Diego, it was a good example for that. When universities sent all the students home, there were, and in UC San Diego, a bunch of students live on campus. In the first 2 years, they live in colleges. 5,000 students didn't have a home to go back to, or didn't have a home they could have bandwidth to learn properly. So UC San Diego put them in dorms, separate, not with roommates, so that they can maintain social distancing and allow them to stay and learn, and gave them all the resources to continue and to succeed. So universities care a lot about this. Other universities were less pro-social about that. I can give some examples of very famous universities, just send everybody home from today to tomorrow. Maybe they have fewer students that have these issues, but it's certainly the case that universities, especially at the UC system, have done a lot in order to help maintain the equality in access to education during this pandemic. And just as a side point, our campus has started testing everybody, and they tested all these 5,000, and none of them are infected with COVID-19. So that's good news.
That is good news. I completely agree with the question that we are, all of us, each of us, differently situated to ride this wave of a crisis. And we as universities, as educators, have to understand that. So one of the things that we did, and a lot of other campuses did, was to move to pass-fail for this semester, because not only, as the question said, not everybody has the space and the privacy and the quiet, environment to continue learning in quarantine, but different people have different health risks and, both physical and emotional ways to cope with everything that's going on right now. And so we have to have so much empathy and understanding. Again, as educators, I keep telling my colleagues and kind of our faculty to try to also connect on that personal level with our students. And I think we do a good job at it. I know that Anna, as dean, also is doing a lot of town meetings, town halls, and then personal meetings with students who have specific challenges. We also, something that we've been debating as a faculty, as a university, is whether we should be demanding people, our students, turning on their videos. Again, it's better to have that face-to-face interaction. I think it creates more engagement, more commitment to the classroom. At the same time, we know that not everybody has, that privacy. So I'm actually right now just thinking about this, what I'll demand next week from my Tel Aviv classroom. I was told by Tel Aviv University that the students don't have to turn on their video in terms of the university faculty or policy. And they also don't always have to even show up at Tel Aviv University. So they told me that I don't have to take account of who's participating, and I'm just going to be recording the class. I hope nobody's in my class who's listening to this, because I am actually going to require them to show up to class, and I'm going to tell them that if at all possible, I want to see their faces. I want to see, like I'm looking at Lee right now, and she's smiling when I say, Lee. It's so important. It's very tiring to look at a screen, and it's very tiring actually cognitively to not have that immediate human response to whatever you're saying. So we need that. But absolutely, given, this question of how there are inequities, we have to balance that with the individualized challenges and situations of all our students.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. This is, of course, a very interesting and ongoing conversation that I hope our viewers will continue to think about as we see how the pandemic plays out. But I want to extend another thank you to Orly Lobel and Onamir. And I'm happy to introduce Maya, who will be introducing the next debate and speakers. And we hope that all of you will stay with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Lee, for the introduction, for the great panel. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to extend a very special welcome to our guest, Boaz Bismuth, current editor-in-chief of Israel Hayom, where he also served in the past as foreign affairs editor. From 1990 to 2004, he served as Paris correspondent for the daily Yediot Ahronot, and also has had a diplomatic career from 2004 to 2008, serving as Israel's ambassador to Mauritania. Elad Strohmeyer is the current spokesperson for the Embassy of Israel in DC, a role that he has had since 2018. Elad joined Israel's diplomatic corps in 2010, and as spokesperson, he serves as a resource for editors, journalists, and broadcasters to receive information and official statements on issues relating to Israel. And last but not least, Oren Nahari, journalist and commentator. Oren has over 35 years of experience in public broadcasting. He brought thousands of reports, in-depth documentaries, interviews, and articles, as well as special programs for all over the world. For all of you, my name is Maya Even. I'm a rising sophomore at the George Washington University studying international affairs, and I'm a Mishelanu fellow. I'm so excited to be here. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Thanks again for joining us. So gentlemen, without further ado, let's get started. So we're living in an unprecedented period. I think it goes without saying. Let's start with you, Boaz. Do you call anything like this, or do you think it's a unique moment in history?
What we're seeing right now? Well, I'll be honest with you. No, I'm not that young anymore. 56 is an age. It's an age. And I mean, and I had the privilege of seeing many things as a journalist. You know, you're seeing events. I mean, you're seeing history in becoming. You see, I mean, you cover big events. It can be the Kosovo War, Iraq #1, Iraq #2, Afghanistan. So many events, wars, revolutions, elections, and all assignments. Really very astonishing. But this thing, the coronavirus, and what we're doing right now, this Zoom thing, I mean, the way we're contacting, connecting, making this meeting, is that something that I never thought that I would see the day. And I must say that as we're still in it, and we're in Israel right now, are so much afraid of a second vague, of course. But still, I mean, this is something that is so unique, so different. But at the same time, many things, I believe, many things that we'll see at the end of the day are things that anyway would have happened, but this coronavirus is only speeding events. And I'll give you an example of that. Maybe if you permit me, if I have some time, I'll explain. There is a book that I always suggest youngsters to read, and it's The World of Yesterday of Stefan Zweig. The World of Yesterday, I mean, Stefan Zweig, when he wrote the book, I mean, he was in Vienna, and Vienna was with its splendor. I mean, the Philharmonic, the opera, writers. When Stefan Zweig wanted, for example, to write an op-ed, he went to Theodor Herzl, that was a publisher of the paper. I mean, these were really amazing days. He never thought that two world wars were ahead of him. And the world has changed. And why am I saying that? God forbid, I'm not seeing, I do not wish, I do not want any war, not a big war and not a small war. But at the same time, I do think that we live like a transition period. This is a transition time. Now, transition is not something that is happening in months, not even in few years. Transition can also be a few decades, because decades in space and time is nothing. And I do believe that the changes we're going to see right now with the EU, I think we shall be able to develop it later on with the EU, with China, America, and China coming over, taking over, with Europe losing of its strength. Also, the way of doing politics, the way of doing journalism, the way of doing communication, the way of so many things. I mean, the world is changing right in front of us. And I think that this coronavirus era that we live, this event, is also maybe speeding it. I say maybe because one thing, one can be sure and certain, is all those events oblige us to be much more humble. And as you say in English, wait and see, let's wait and see. But I do believe, again, to conclude, that these are a phenomena, a transition time that anyway we were living, and this would only speed the event. And to answer your question by yes or no, did I thought of living a plague? Well, the answer is no. But at the same time, you mentioned me being ambassador in Mauritania. When I reached Mauritania, you know, you had the Bnei Israel, the Israelis, you know, in Egypt. Egypt had 10 plagues, and one of them was the, how do you call this in English? Arbe. It's the locust. Now I remember locust. So when I got to Mauritania as an ambassador, after 1 week I had locust, and I said to myself, after this, I can't see anything more strange. Coronavirus was much more unique. So you see.
Thank you, Oren. What do you think?
Okay, since Boaz started with Old Vienna, so I'll carry on with Old Vienna. In 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was murdered in Sarajevo. And some people say this caused World War I. This was not the cause. This was the trigger. And the coronavirus, what we see today, I think, and we'll talk about it in the next 45 minutes or so, I don't think that the coronavirus makes all the currents that we see in the world today. I think that it speeds them up. I think that in some ways slows them down. We'll talk about globalization, and perhaps it turns them to the right or to the left, but it does not create them. I think also two other things, and again, with relation to what Boaz said. I think that in 20 or 30 years' time, we'll see this as another event. Now we are living in it. We are living in it, so it is huge, and it is huge. But let's remember, from AIDS, something like 40 million people died. We have the SARS and the MERS. They were in Asia, so we didn't put that much attention to it, but millions were dead upon it. Today, we are living in the age of social media. That makes the whole difference. 15 years ago, there was no Facebook. 15 years ago, there was no broadband. 15 years ago, there was no Zoom or smartphones, etc., etc. So these days, we're living in a totally different environment in this time of Corona. But again, and Boaz and I, we worked with each other, and we remember the fall of the Berlin Wall and Yugoslavia and Rwanda, etc., etc. I think that in 30 years' time, it'll be another event to tell our children, you remember that, oh, you didn't hear about it? How come? What do they teach you at school?
Thank you. Elad, I obviously going off of this question of what an unprecedented period we're living, but going to our next question, how do you think this will affect international travel?
I think it's very difficult to assess the impacts right now. Like Oren said, we're living the crisis, we're living the pandemic at the moment, so that's part of the impacts. I do want to talk for a second about the unprecedented period and take it from what Oren said. The reality is that it's not unprecedented. We had many other events in history more catastrophic than this one, but the fact that it meets the age of globalization, social media magnifies it in a way that we never experienced. So the big answer is no, it's not unprecedented, but the reality is that it is very, very unique because of the times that we live. And that really brings me to your question about the international travel, because in the past, when we had pandemic, the Spanish flu, and further back, international travel was not that available. There was no such availability for international travel like we have today. When cost of airfare is so cheap, in Europe, for example, it's cheaper to fly than take a train. Also here in the United States, in most places, we see the effect now on international travel. People are more suspicious. We see at the moment that borders are closing. And this is part of the reaction that we see regardless to the pandemic, to globalization, to the open border phenomena that we see in the past few decades. And the virus right now really accelerate some of the trends, some of the fights between the different forces. So I think we're going to see the effect on international travel in the future, and we're going to see also solutions to that, like Israel is actually trying to do right now, maybe create capsules of travel between countries that are corona-free, and maybe that will be the near future of travel.
Boaz, I'll move to the next question and ask you, I wanted to touch on China for a second. I think it's a very interesting theme. And how do you think will COVID-19 affect US China great power dynamics? And whether, I'll ask you kind of a second part of the question, is China's use of soft and hard power gonna help them propel towards winning? If we can use the term.
No wonder you speak about China. I think it has a relationship with the coronavirus. I think, no, am I correct? I think so. So it's not that strange. Well, China, and of course, you're now, right now in the US, I think. So I think I'll start with your permission before speaking about the soft power, speak a little bit about China and the US, because, let's not forget, these are the world's leading economies, with all due respect. The US, is still the biggest, but China is getting, what would I say, it's getting stronger, even with the coronavirus, by the way, in a rapid pace. And I think that the two countries have fought, I mean, for long trade wars, and as you can see, and but they both, and this is the thing that is very odd, and we know it also, this was also before the coronavirus. We didn't need to wait for the coronavirus to know that they depend on each other. Because China, as you know, better than me, I think, that funds the US economy and essentially it lets it run its debt, you know, by buying his bonds. But on strategic level, I mean, those two countries that depend on each other are still, I mean, how would I say, I mean, they're adversaries. As you know, China, of course, is ongoing, some would say aggression, some would say aspiration in Asia, and not only in Asia, also in all over the world. And this is something that is very interesting. And you see what's going on between China and America. I think that this is, for me, right now in international relationship, international affair, the main event. Now for countries, I mean, if I would be, for example, now Australia, or even in Israel in some way, although we're very close to America, of course, you do not wish right now in those coming years to be the meat in the sandwich between those two giants that will have a certain confrontation. But at the end of the day, as they depend on each other, and as they can do business together, and we have seen that beautifully in the trade deal they made in the White House, I mean, just after the beginning of the coronavirus, I think it was in January, correct me if I'm wrong. So we can see that they, on one hand, they're big competitors. On the other hand, they can make business together. But right now, as I think Oren said before, everything we're seeing, it's as if, I mean, we're living all those huge events live, and it's happening now. But again, I mean, in a few years from now, we shall see this episode as a big, how would I say, big confrontation, but they will have to live together. The big question is not 10 years from now, but a few decades from now, where will China and some might add also India, where will they be? And whereas West and America, and when I say West and Europe, where will they be? Now, concerning the soft power of China, I think that China handles it beautifully. And if you permit me, I'll give you maybe an insight to show you how the Chinese function. Is it good? Is it bad? It's a fact. When I was serving in Africa, in Mauritania, so for example, when Chinese, for example, had got a deal or a business, for example, they had the deal of building the new Nouakchott airport. So, or the port or whatever. It's not that they only send the employees, they will send their families with them, they'll send the grocery with them. In a way, it's also, if you want, a soft invasion. You speak about the coronavirus, I mean, don't forget the mask that Italy or Serbia or Iran, for example, at the beginning they got them from Iran. So for some countries, I mean, China was the source of coronavirus. Other countries will tell you, I mean, thank you, China, that you came and helped us because Corona wasn't our fault. So you see, it's not exactly black and white. And again, we need some perspective. And as everything is happening right now, so it's very, very difficult to judge. Again, wait and see. Let's not let's be patient to see what's going on between those two giants. But these are giants.
Yeah. Elad, what do you think about the issue?
I agree with the boss here. I think we need to be careful with writing a eulogy to the U.S. power and to the U.S. influence in the world. It's maybe easy now to sense that maybe there is a change in light of everything that is happening, but the U.S. is much more powerful, much more influential than one might think. I also think that going back to what I said earlier, in the age of globalization, it's difficult to determine winning and losing. It's not so determined anymore. In the age of interdependency, we see these countries rely on one another, and many countries need to have relationship with both China and the United States. So it's not necessarily the Cold War world when you had the two camps. Everybody's saying that we're leading to that world, that there's going to be the China camp and the US camp, but today I think it's much more difficult to go there. It's not saying that China is not rising. I definitely agree that we see the influence of China. I served in Africa, and we definitely, before the pandemic, for sure, we saw the influence that China had on African countries, the investment that they're putting there. But still, I think that it's too early to say that the United States is losing its influence. And time will tell when we see how this pandemic and this crisis will evolve. We will better be able to assess the relations between these two powers. But even today, when it seems that it's very tense, there are still talks, there are still relations, there are still finding ways to cooperate despite all the challenges that they're facing.
Oh, and I wanted to move with you to the next question and ask you, I mean, in the past few years, I think we've heard a lot about Euroscepticism, I think especially from within Europe. I mean, we see countries like Italy, some parties in Italy and Germany and Hungary. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, you know, we see Brexit pushing forward and a divided pandemic response like Sweden and not really imposing a lockdown. So does this leave the EU and what's its future? I mean, do we see a disband or a withdrawal of some countries in the future?
Just one remark before I delve into your question. We have to remember that concerning the United States-China relationship, and that's a huge, huge topic, that the United States is, of course, in an election year. And it has some bearing about the declarations of President Trump, etc. Now, moving to the EU. One of the things that happened, and Corona magnified it a lot, is, of course, the anti-globalization movement and, of course, rise of nationalism in various forms, from each country trying to protect its own, and, of course, some countries working together as the EU. And the EU has always moved between the different poles of working together, of coming into terms, and of course the centrifugal powers that wants to tear it apart. We see today, first of all, we see the EU of the 28, Britain is still there. You cannot manage an organization with 28 veto powers. It doesn't work, never did. And then we see the North versus the South. We see the countries of the South that were hit the hardest. Spain, Italy, Greece, something like between 15 and 20% of the economies of these countries is tourism, and it's dead. It didn't get from 100 to 50, 100 to 20. It went from 100 to 0, to total zero. It's millions of unemployed in this tourism alone. And we see them coming hand in hand, begging for bonds, begging for money. And now the countries of the North, meaning Germany, after all, they say, okay, we are ready for Corona bonds, but as a loan, not as a grant. We were there in 2008, we cannot go that route again. We see, of course, the schism between West and East, between the West, again, Germany and France, the traditional leaders, and we see countries like Poland, like Hungary, who used the opportunity of this coronavirus to be even more authoritarian, Hungary, than it was before. So we see all these dilemmas, we see all these different directions. I do not see the EU breaking up. I see it changing. I see it changing in ways that I'm not sure if I had to bet, I would say that the thing that I could bet is that perhaps the coronavirus will be the end of the euro, that this doesn't work anymore. You cannot have a single currency serving both the economy and the politics of Germany and that of Italy. It doesn't work.
Boaz, what are your thoughts on this?
In order to make it interesting, so I would say that, first of all, I agree with many things Oren said, but I do believe that the EU will explode at the end. It will not continue. The euro, concerning the Eurozone, it is kind of obvious that it will be, I mean, I once or so during a few years ago, during the Greek crisis, already they started to speak about, that's it, I mean, changing, I mean, or on the contrary, deleting many countries from the Eurozone who also do not wish to be there. And I think that if you permit me to be a bit more, less rational and more emotional, although it's a very rational discussion that we have, I would say that Europe had amazing successes, by the way. Peace in Europe for so many decades, that's success number one. I think they even won the Nobel Prize for that. But I would say that the biggest failure is when you see, for example, you know, every country you go among the 27, 28, members, I mean, you'll always see, for example, the Swedish flag and the European flag, the French flag and the European flag, the Belgian flag and the European flag, the French flag or whatever. And you would see emotion towards your national flag, and you would see a very cold attitude towards the European flag. And I would say that the biggest failure of Brussels, of Brussels, where they sit, where the base, where the hardcore is, where the capital, if you want, is, they did not succeed in making Europeans, and after so many decades, how would I say, also a certain emotional view or look towards, I mean, their this entity that they built, which had its logic, of course, and again, as I said before, its success. And I would add also another thing, the coronavirus, because that's what we're talking about today, also showed the limits of the EU and the strength of each and every state. First of all, in big, I would say that we have seen the undoing of globalization. For me, that was very, very clear, undoing of globalization. But again, to be precise, I'll give you an example, for example. During, it's not only to show you not only EU, but all those international organizations. Italy, for example, Italy who suffered a lot, who suffered the most at the beginning of this coronavirus. We used to see those pictures from hospitals in Italy, and we're like horrified if you remember. And then Italians were waiting for help. And some of the countries, some of the neighbor countries, well, they said, you know, maybe you need mask or whatever, or oxygen apparatus, but we might need them, you know, in a few weeks. So we're not in a hurry to give you this thing. So it made European countries understand they have to rely, first of all, on themselves. So I would say that this coronavirus crisis, pandemic, also showed the limits of the EU. And another thing I said before, look at NATO. I mean, Italians, for example, didn't think of asking NATO, and NATO didn't even think of coming. This is not the EU, I'm talking of another international institution or organization, did not even think of helping a country like Italy. So again, this was undoing of globalization, and on the contrary, understanding that you have to rely on yourself. And countries like Australia, countries like even Great Britain, countries who cannot even manufacture a fork, they can't even know how to make a spoon right now, they understood that, I mean, if you have such a crisis like today and you have no communication and you're limited, well, it's about time to renew also my own industry. So we have also to count, like us, human beings. First of all, we count on ourselves.
I would like to add one sentence to what Boaz said. The greatest mistake, in my opinion, of the EU thinking, and I remember, and Boaz know it as well, as we talked with diplomats and then the statesmen of the EU for many years, and they would tell us with a smug smile, you in the Middle East, poor natives, you don't know that nationalism doesn't work anymore. It doesn't exist. We cured this disease. And they really believed it, that we are going to a world where there will be no nationalism, sort of, end of history of Fukuyama. And it doesn't work. Nationalism exists and will exist ever and ever. You can tame it. You don't have to go to the extreme of it, but it is there.
Great.
Elad, I wanted to move with you to the next question and ask you, I mean, you know, the pandemic has really highlighted, I think, significant gaps in the security agendas for a lot of countries. How do you think is this going to affect security policy specifically moving forward?
So I think what we see from this pandemic, and again, the pandemic is an accelerator of trends that we've seen in the past decades, is the changing of the concept of what it means to talk about national security. Security is not measured only by the number of tanks and missiles and the size of your air force. There are many other layers to national security. There's the economic aspect, there's the social aspect, and now health. And the way you deal with health crisis is one element of that. Really brings me back to what we discussed at the beginning. No one would predict that we will be in a situation like that, but everybody predicted that. That's the reality. That's the duality of the situation that we're in. And now we're going to see that many countries need to adjust their national security strategy toward these new threats. I think Israel, again, is one of a good example. Was even featured in the world media on that. That's my job to follow the world media. And the way the IDF, the army, was recruited to help deal with the pandemic. For example, the entire procurement process was done by the Ministry of Defense. Many of the elements regarding running the crisis were done by the IDF, by the Ministry of Defense, in conjunction with the other authorities. So that's really an understanding that health and this pandemic is a matter of national security. And add to that another layer of all the conspiracies, and I don't know what's true and what's true, or what is not true, that the origin of these viruses from a lab, biological warfare. Again, I'm not saying that's the case, but the concept of biological warfare is not new. It's something that every country is getting ready for. So I think, again, this pandemic is an accelerator to all these trends that bring us on the path forward much faster, I think, than we anticipated or predicted.
Oren, what are your thoughts on the matter?
The security gaps.
Yes.
We see now the rise of China, and we see how China, even in the last week, it has another second carrier. It moved into the Indian Ocean. I'm talking last week alone. It declared the South China Sea is now under their dominion, and any airplane entering the islands that are disputed they will not shoot it down, but they declare it will be inside their own airspace. And this is China alone. And we see other players in the area. We see India. I'm not saying that the Chinese are invincible. They are not. They succeed marvelously in uniting everybody else against them. And we see the powers of India. We see the powers of course, the United States and others. We see that in several crucial areas, the Chinese have a problem. Let's talk about what a country needs today. And again, and I agree with my colleagues that we see now a break in globalization. I don't think that it will be forever. I think the globalization will return, especially commerce. But in the crucial areas of chips, computer chips, and even more than that, energy and food. The United States has a self-supply of energy and food. The EU can supply its own needs in food, but not in energy. Russia can have energy, but not food and not chips. And China is lacking in all three. They have a problem. They have a real problem. So again, China will thrive in a world that is global and at peace. The United States can thrive in the world, of course, of peace. I don't say that the United States wants a war, but it can thrive also in place of let's say, of a confrontation. And other countries, the smaller ones, from regional powers, from Turkey and Iran and even Israel and Brazil, etc., and others, will have to take a long, hard look about what they can do to supply themselves in a time of a total breakup of the international order. The international order is good. I don't agree with Boaz, my friend, on that, but I think that it is good and everybody prosper within. But we see now times that will be, at least in the short run, will be less good than they were in the last 20 years, and we'll see more confrontations. And again, you have to rely on yourself, and every country have to start to think about what it does in this situation, especially in the Middle East, where several countries and elsewhere in the world do not fully think that the United States will come to help them, as it did in the past. They do not rely on the United States as they used to.
If I may add something on that point, I think when we talk about the gaps in security and relating to what Oren said, we need to understand that also the concept of conflict has changed. Today, when we talked about, in the past, when we talked about conflicts on resources, every big war was eventually on resources and influence. It became a full-blown war as we know it. And today, not that the likelihood of war changed or evaporated from the world. I think war is still a viable possibility and a viable threat, but there are many other elements of a conflict and levels of conflict that you can do. So that's part of the questions of security. And we see the competitions between different countries on the resources. What was in the past maybe would have led us to war. Today, we see it in different ways. We see the cyber attacks. We see, in general, the entire cyber world. And also, again, we see the competition when it comes to the ventilators, for example, or the swabs and the test kits. This is part of these trends that Oren is talking about, and Boaz talked about it as well. And that also relates to the questions that we've discussed earlier about the EU. Will it go to the place of cooperation to solve that, or to the conflict? I'm difficult for me to answer. I'm not going to try and predict, but I think the reality is that this is the next step when we look at it. how countries will find different ways to maintain their national security in the new means that they have. Because today, when we talk about national security, we talk about ventilators, how many ventilators you have. So I think, so it's not the traditional conflicts and the traditional wars like we used to know.
Boaz, I'll move with you to the next question and ask you, I mean, as we look forward, how do you think this pandemic has affected, I mean, how will organized crime and terrorism, I mean, how are terrorism and organized crime going to be affected by this pandemic? Do you expect an increase? I mean, will we see heavily patrolled borders? Having talked about international travel too.
You know, since the first, I mean, man, since the beginning of our story of mankind in the Bible, you had good and evil. You had two brothers, one was good, Cain and Abel, and one was evil. So don't think that the pandemic will start making, I mean, our world amazing and people will stop, crime will stop. On the other hand, but before I answer your question, permit me just one last thing concerning China. You asked Elad or Owen, or one of them made a remark that they can't count on America coming to save them. So I was thinking while they were talking, maybe they'll think of China coming to save them. But there is one point before we conclude talking about international affairs and China and America. One thing, don't forget that this is maybe the strong point or the strong part of America is the cultural aspect. I mean, people dream of a green card. They can be in Bangladesh, they can be in Syria, they can be in France, or they dream to have a green card. They don't dream to have a red card. Or when they go to a bar, they ask for a Budweiser, not for a Shintao, and they want a burger and not a Pekingese duck. And I think that this is a strength of the Americans. I mean, this is the cultural, and this is something that China still has to work a lot on. But this is just a little remark. Now, concerning crime and how will it affect the pandemic by itself? Look, as we spoke, I mean, unfortunately, we said before that this was the undoing of globalization. If you remember, that's what we said, and some of my friends here in the panel, I mean, did agree. Maybe it depends for how long, but I would say that on the contrary, when it comes to fighting international crime, which will continue and which will unfortunately prosper because they will always find a way to prosper, then in this way, I would say that globalization still will become something that countries, I mean, will need and will become important. Unfortunately, if you speak of crimes, there is a point, I think that also in America, this was a few events that did not add, not to our health, not to our proud. And this was when you can see that people, I mean, on the contrary, they use, I mean, the pandemic in order to prosper and to use it, I mean, for their own purpose. You saw, I mean, the black market selling what they sell or stealing it, whatever. And even states and countries, competition between them, sometimes in order to get some access to some of the products you need in order to fight the pandemic, also sometimes were done not in a very, how would I say, not in a very Catholic way. So again, I mean, pandemic comes, and on the contrary, it finds you ways to find new ways of doing wrong, unfortunately.
Elad, what are your thoughts?
I think terrorism, when it faces an obstacle, terrorist organizations and the terrorist groups, they always find a way to overcome these obstacles, and they find new ways to attack and new ways to affect us. That's the challenge that we're facing fighting terror. So today with COVID and restrictions on travel, maybe it's more difficult for them in some ways, but on the other hand, they're creative. They're very creative, unfortunately. And I think the best example is we see until today, still now during this crisis, we see the export of terrorism by Iran. They don't let the fact that there are no air travel between countries to stop them. They don't let the fact that they have such a big impact and so many people are dying in Iran from this pandemic to use their resources, the resources that they have already to support terrorist organizations that affect not just Israel like Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but terrorist organizations that affect globally all the way to Latin America, for sure in the Middle East. Their malign activity continues today. So they always find way. Channeling money doesn't stop at the age of the pandemic. Channeling illegal funds continues during the age of the pandemic. It's not connected to international travel. So in that sense, I think that terrorism, unfortunately, will continue, and we need to continue fight it. And maybe now they have some challenges, but they're very, I think, very small, and they will overcome it, and we need to be more sophisticated than them. So that's, I think, a misconception that people think that because of the crisis, terrorist groups are weaker now, and let's give money to Iran because they're suffering to help the people who are suffering. But the reality is that exactly these organizations and these regimes, like the Iranian regimes and other terrorist groups, they exploit the sensitivity and the vulnerability of the world in this situation, and we should not let that happen.
So we have some questions from our public, but Oren, some questions that are very similar to what we have been talking about right now. For example, someone asked, will COVID-19 renew spirit of global cooperation, or will it harden international distrust? So I think, what do you think, thinking about the previous question and moving to this one, what are your thoughts?
On the previous question, I'll say that everything that men invented, men and women, they used it for the bad and they use it for the worse, for the good. So again, terrorism will find new ways. We see in the social media, we see the rise of anti-Semitism related to Corona. We see the rise of hate speech, and we see also the rise in trying to recruit terrorists and try to attack everybody. We see that everything. It happens. Now, concerning the question about global cooperation, first of all, we see global cooperation. We see it. We see it in science, first and foremost. We see it in scientists coming from all around the world, trying to solve this huge pandemic, trying to bring vaccines, trying to create new ways. And we see the entire scientific community working on this. We see also people trying to help one another. There is good in mankind. We have to remember it. There is good in the Homo sapiens. And yes, countries will have to work together. As Boaz said before, the United States and China, of course, they are competitors. Maybe they are adversaries, but they are also codependents. Again, the same with the United States and the EU, or the United States and NATO. The same with Japan and South Korea. So again, after the pandemic, we'll see a rise again of commerce. We'll see manufacturing returns. The borders, I think, will be closed tighter than the word before, and I think there'll be a long, hard look. Immigration, not because of keeping the Chinese out because they brought this pandemic, but I think that countries will be more, how shall I say it, more nationalistic. They'll be more egoistic, so to speak. But again, I'll see that commerce will return, manufacturing will return, and of course, the changing of ideas will return.
Boaz, what are your thoughts on this question, cooperation against distrust?
Again, not a lot to add, only I'll continue with what Oren said at the end, that on one hand, you'll need to cooperate a lot. On the contrary, you see right now, countries, in a way, of course, you've got this in you, of course, the competition, for example. Let's take, for example, the case of the vaccine. So every country, of course, with its proudness, every modern or country that has got advanced in this domain would like to be the first one. Yet at the same time, you see how much they share. Countries share, for example, Israel. Not a long time ago, we got from Japan a certain medicine. they share together. We share together. Israel also shares their knowledge with America, for example, I think in this domain. So you will see the cooperation. But at the same time, you remember you have a president right now and you've got elections, this America first. You remember America first? So now it's going to be in France, they'll say France first, India first, Italy first. This brand, this saying of Trump will be adopted by so many countries because we do need, with all due respect, countries still, even if it's the downgoing of globalization, this is one point, but cooperation is a very, very important case. And I'll tell you something. I will not tell you with which politician, but as you know, we have a new government in Israel a few weeks ago. By the way, it's a very big government. Even if you want to be a minister coming to Israel, I'll find you a seat. And I spoke to one of the politicians, and I told him that if I would be today, an Israeli politician, which I'm not, of course, thank God. One of the I would ask to be a minister of cooperation. And I think that this is, and in France they have it, and it's a very important ministry, I think, a portfolio, because nowadays cooperation, especially after again, as we talk about the coronavirus, it's a very important mission. And that's why also in many, many countries, it's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation. And today cooperation will come even before Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because the Minister of Foreign Affairs has to take care, first of all, of his own country.
I think one of the challenges and one of the outcomes of this pandemic, everybody's talking about the medical ramification of it, the economic ramification, but I think eventually we need to look at the social ramifications. People are suspicious towards one another. You walk, I go in my building here in Washington, I go in the elevator, the neighbors, if there are neighbors in the elevator, they're fearing you, like you're a threat to them, my presence at the elevator. So I think we see that everywhere. People are afraid from one another. And that translates exactly like what Boaz said, in my opinion, to the relations between countries. If people in the streets are suspicious to one another, why would I, as an Israeli, for example, won't be suspicious to a country? Oh my God, they have coronavirus. I don't want them to come to my country. So this is something that I think you can fix the medical problems, you'll fix the economy, but the suspiciousness between people and because of that, between countries, that's going to be much harder to fix, to build this cooperation. I'm an optimistic, so I think it's possible. I think we will get there, but maybe not in the same level that we had so far, and it will take time.
You're lucky, only to interfere, Elad, you're very lucky in Washington, because you said before that all your neighbors are running one from each other when you go to the elevator. Me, you see in Tel Aviv, they knock on my door to sneeze. So you're very lucky. Maybe I'll come to Washington.
Not now, Boaz. Now is not the time to go to Washington.
Not now. Okay, so I'll stay here. I'm very happy in Tel Aviv.
We have time for one last question. And Elad, I'll actually stay with you. I think you touched this multiple times in your last answer. But I mean, how do you think will COVID affect global? I mean, I think more the concept of global citizen.
I think this is, again, conflicting terms and depends who you ask. I think people who saw themselves as global citizens before the pandemic still see themselves as global citizens. They still think that the solution is cooperation. They don't like the nationalism actions taken by government. They're protesting against it. If before the pandemic, they were against immigration, they were against the globalization world, this will just harden their opinion. So I think the reality is that in that sense, the corona didn't change anything. If you supported globalization, you supported after the corona. If you didn't, you stayed in where you are, you may be more entrenched in your position. And this is the acceleration that I was talking about earlier during the coronavirus. People maybe are more entrenched in what they believe, if they believe that you need to do more cooperation or not. But again, it's very soon to know, because we need to see how countries will respond to open borders and international travel. Like we started to talk about international travel, we need to see how it will evolve in the future, and then we'll see what will happen to the concept of global citizens.
I'd like to add that I agree totally, but one thing, I think that the concept of a global citizen was hurt not because of nationalism, but because of the economy. It's very easy to be the global citizen when you are hopscotching between high-tech lucrative positions between, let's say, Tel Aviv, Palo Alto, and what have you. But once the giants of this world, the high-tech giants and other companies are hurt because of the pandemic, because of global recession, because of the shrinkage of economies, then the number of people that thought about themselves as global citizens, even if they sleep in Tel Aviv in a very high-priced apartment which they rent, and they don't have that much money, and now suddenly their whole concept of living is totally changed. Once you are 30 and return to live with your parents because you don't have a job, either in the United States, Europe, or Israel, then suddenly the concept of global citizens shrinks very, very rapidly.
So, I mean, I could go for hours with this, but it's time for us to wrap. Thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, and thank you to our guests, Boaz Bismuth, Elad Strohmeyer, Oren Nahari. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time to join our Mishelanu panel, How I Turned My Love for Israel into a Career, with Roni Ruchman, Niv Stendel, and Farah Shmorian. Again, thank you so much for everybody who joined, our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.